And welcome everyone. So this is the third in a series of presentations from Sustainable Stow with Randall Library in Stow. We are designing these presentations to help everyone begin to think about the implications of climate change as they apply to your own homes, yards, activities going forward. There'll be a range of topics. Some of them get involved in things like, are you ready to buy an EV car? Some of them may have to do with how do you heat and cool your home? But a number have to do with how are you managing the green space around you? Because that is a very important point, a part of managing climate change. There's a new research report that came out just this week that talked about the relationship between maintaining species diversity and fighting climate change. So this is a really critical topic. And we're very glad to have Jessie Panek with us tonight. Welcome, Jessie. And Jessie is a retired landscape designer. I don't know if landscape designers ever get to retire, but she says she's retired. And she's a long-term interest in native plants and ecology. Her landscape design education was received at Radcliffe Seminars, and she got a native plant studies certificate from the Native Plant Trust. She's taught many classes. Some of you may have taken them from her at Garden in the Woods, which is part of Native Plant Trust. In addition to working on her own extensive garden in Harvard, Mass, she also enjoys bird watching, which we were talking about a few minutes ago, and watercolor painting, which we haven't talked about yet. We may get to that yet. But anyway, welcome, Jessie. We are so glad to have you here as our guest tonight.
Well, thank you. Now let me see if I can share my screen like we planned. Here we go. Share. And hopefully you now are looking at flowers, native plants. You all seeing things?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining me tonight on this absolutely gorgeous day. We're going to be talking about planting with native species. And I hope you will all learn some new things, as I have certainly learned things while preparing for this talk. It's always a lot of fun to do something like that. So first of all, we have to say, why are we talking about plants? And it's really kind of funny. As humans, we're a bit myopic. We like animals, and we focus on megafauna like snow leopards and elephants because somehow we think they're something like ourselves. So becoming attached to monarch butterflies, as we have recently, is actually great progress. Because the idea that we can be fond of an insect is, well, it's risky to admit that butterflies are insects for a lot of people. I know that might push it out of the realm of possibility. But that charismatic insect is opening the door to making people more aware of other life forms. But why should we care about plants in particular? Well, it's because they can do something we cannot, something that other animals cannot. Through the magic of photosynthesis, with water and energy from the sun, they take carbon dioxide from the air, turn it into oxygen and carbohydrates in the form of plant tissue. Plants are essential to life on Earth, specifically to the flow of energy that enables life. Now, plants are the basis of really all food chains. Most food chains, like the one I've shown here, include insects, because insects are a critical step in the transfer of energy from plants to all other animals that are not themselves herbivores. And we'll be coming back to that later. So today we're going to look at our native plants in particular, but I'm actually not going to talk so much about how beautiful or easy to grow our native plants are, but rather why we need to grow them. But first of all, we need to ask, what is a native plant? There are actually a lot of definitions and narrow or broad, and all of them can be true. But like in a lot of conversations, if we don't define a term in the same way, we end up disagreeing because we don't really understand what the other person's saying. So let's try to define what we mean. Generally, it's agreed that a native plant is a wild plant, that is, growing without human assistance. Beyond that, a definition of native usually includes a time frame. So this is an interesting plant on the left. It's a ginkgo tree. And some people say this should be called native because according to the fossil record, it grew in North America at some point. But is that really meaningful to say that the ginkgo is native? It doesn't seem like it to me. On the right, I expect you'll recognize the common dandelion. Now that's very common almost everywhere, certainly grows wild without any human help. And it's been here a long time, but it was brought to the colonies of the United States area as a food and medicinal plant. Many people would probably call the dandelion naturalized, but it would not usually be called native because a plant was traditionally considered native to the United States only if it's growing here before the colonists arrived. The colonists' arrival was essentially like the early days of globalization, the beginning of that process. The point is that a native is a plant or animal not introduced by humans, either intentionally or accidentally. Now, a definition of native should also say where we're talking about. After all plants are native somewhere. But what does it take to consider them native here? Of course, it depends on exactly what here is. Now, I don't think any of us are likely to call these two plants native, but they're native to our Western Hemisphere. And this is a saguaro cactus. Most of us would also not say the cactus is native. After all, it can't grow here, but it is native to the United States. Now, this is a coneflower, Echinacea purpurea, and it grows well in our area. And many gardeners in New England would call it native. But is it? It's found growing wild in parts of the eastern United States, but actually not as far north as Massachusetts, even though it's completely hardy here. Now, as gardeners, as I suspect some of you are, we tend to think of hardiness as the main criteria for where a plant grows, whether a plant can survive in our temperatures. However, there are many reasons why a plant is found wild in one area and not another. So in the past, botanists spoke of plants as being native to a geographic political region, the United States or New England, maybe Massachusetts or Middlesex County, or even a town. But since plants don't pay attention to political boundaries, saying a plant was native was really a statement about what had been found in a given jurisdiction. It might exist elsewhere, but had not been documented. Now, historical documentation is certainly very helpful, but right now I think we're looking for a guide for the future about what plants ought to be in a given area in the ecologically disrupted world that we live in. When I started teaching at Garden in the Woods about native perennials, I used the traditional time frame of pre-colonial to define native. But for where a plant is native, the Native Plant Trust was using a relatively new geographic definition of a unit called an ecoregion. Now, ecoregions are areas defined by a diverse and very carefully determined set of criteria, but it includes all sorts of things: climate, vegetation, geology, rainfall, the terrain, the wildlife, land use, and even the human impact. In other words, an ecoregion defines an area with a similar ecosystem. Now, on this map, we see the United States divided into about 10 broad areas, with each area sharing common ecological characteristics. But you can add or narrow the criteria to break down each of these subregions into more. Now, you see how we're getting level 2 ecoregions, where it divides the initial ecoregions into smaller units, into smaller areas. And then if you keep going, you can get level 3, which breaks down the area even more into over 100 level 3 ecoregions, just by using more and more narrow criteria. You can see that the smaller units nest more or less inside the larger ones. The boundaries of these ecoregions are not rigid, however, and they can change over time to reflect reality on the ground. Plants tend to grow as part of a particular ecosystem, which can be very general or very specific. For example, some plants will grow across most of the entire level 1 ecoregion, which is called the Eastern Temperate Forest, or others may be limited to just a single, much more narrowly defined ecoregion level 3, and they would never move beyond that without human intervention. So one advantage of using ecoregions to think about a plant's native range is that it tells you where a plant might likely be found, even if it hasn't yet been documented there. Why? Because everywhere in an ecoregion shares certain characteristics, and many of those characteristics define what a plant needs, whether it's temperature or pH of the soil or the amount of water. So if a plant is found somewhere in the ecoregion, it's reasonable to think that it might be found other places in it. An individual plant's native range certainly can cross ecoregion boundaries and be in multiple ecoregions, but the maps can help us see what ecosystems or ecological communities a plant is part of. Now, there's a great author that some of you might already know about, but I've used him extensively in preparing this talk. It's the researcher and entomologist and writer Doug Tallamy. In one of his books, he gives a wonderful definition for native that I see as a reflection of the ecoregion concept. He says that native means a plant or animal that has evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. This gives a functional rather than a purely descriptive meaning to the term native. It recognizes that where a species has functioning ecological relationships matters more than where it's been documented in the wild. And even if we don't know what those ecological relationships all are, we can assume that most of them involve other species in the community described by the ecoregion. In Tallamy's view, a plant doesn't become native after a certain period of time, but can only be considered one when it has achieved the same ecological productivity that it did have in its original home. Plants that arrive here from another continent post-colonization and are what we call naturalized, that is growing and spreading without human assistance, like the dandelion, they've only been here for at most 100 or so years. And that's just not enough time to develop the kind of ecological relationships that they had in their homeland. For example, he talks about Phragmites or common reed. It supports 170 different species of insect in Europe. But here, although it's been here for hundreds of years, supports only 5. So globalization of the natural environment is moving plants and insects around much, much faster than they could without humans. And the evolutionary process is slow to catch up. This means even though we have a lot of naturalized plants, most of them are not going to be very ecologically productive. Now let's think again about that purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea. Although it's not traditionally considered native in our Massachusetts area, it could be functionally native if most of its ecological partners are here. And those partners may be present here because much of the coneflower's traditional native range is in the same level 1 ecoregion we are. So here I've taken the approximate rough outline of the Eastern Temperate Forest, which is our ecoregion in level 1, and moved it over onto a map of the coneflower's range, the purple being where it's not considered native and the green where it's native. But you can see there's a lot of overlap with the range with the ecoregion level 1. So it's not unreasonable to think that a lot of those insects might be able to function and be in sort of a relationship with the plant growing up here because we are in the same ecoregion. In contrast, a plant from the Rockies or Washington State, where it's not found wild anywhere in our level 1 ecoregion, is much less likely to have ecological relationships here in Massachusetts, much less plants from Asia. Even though some of our plants have close relatives in Asia, they had millions of years to evolve relationships with those local insects, making them less like our species in ways that matter to the insects. Now, one reason a plant species from south of New England may already have insect partners in our area is that plants move much more slowly than insects. And since the glaciers wiped everything out here just 11,000 years ago, many plants have not yet had time to recolonize our area. Because insects could move much more quickly, they can and may be here. So that's a complicated way of saying some things, but using a definition of native based on relationship makes answering this next question much easier, which is, why should we plant native plants? Basically, it's to restore and strengthen the complex and essential relationships involving plants that have evolved as part of local ecological communities. It's hard for us to realize just how tightly connected the biological world is, but it's become clear that it's much more complex than we ever dreamed. Until we really understand it all, which maybe never, we should at least keep all the parts together, which means putting native plants back into our landscapes. So now let's look at some of those relationships, those important interactions of plants with wildlife. Pollination is, well, I have to say, the big buzz nowadays, and it's a great place to start looking at plant ecology. The most familiar pollinator that people are aware of and concerned about is the honeybee, which ironically is not native, but was introduced by early European colonists for the honey. My point is that you should realize focusing on pollinators doesn't necessarily mean native pollinators. Large-scale agriculture moves honeybees in hives around the country in order to have enough bees to pollinate a large number of flowers in a short time. And for our current agribusiness food system, that's essential. For smaller scale farming and in nature, native bees are very effective at providing pollination. They work in these settings because there are many different plants which flower at different times, providing food for the bees throughout the year. In a monoculture, large-scale farming, after that crop has flowered, there's nothing else for the bees to eat, which is why honeybee hives are driven around to another region's crop. That works for the agricultural system, but it overlooks the importance of our native bees. We need native pollinators, but not primarily for production of our food. We need them because they're a key player in the life of 80 to 90% of all plants. Protecting native pollinators by supporting honeybees is like protecting wild birds by raising chickens. Now, native plants evolved with native bees and other insect pollinators to a mutual advantage. Since plants are literally rooted in place, they need help to exchange genetic material. Now, about 10% of wild plants use wind or water to move pollen from one flower to the next, but 80 to 90% depend entirely on insects for that help. To enlist their help, flowers make sure that insects, especially bees, get a reward of nectar or pollen when they visit flowers. That encourages the insect to go on to similar flowers to get more. In the process, at the next flower, they leave some of the pollen from the last flower, enabling fertilization and the development of seeds, which is, of course, what the plant wants. Now, when insects and plants found a good partner that gave them what they needed, effective pollination and pollen or nectar, they evolved to make that relationship even stronger and more exclusive. For example, some insects' tongues evolved to be the perfect length for the shape of their preferred flowers. You can see the long tube or spur at the back of this flower, well, where the nectar is stored. That's the bumblebee needs to be able to reach deep inside to get his reward for coming to the flower. Since this bee can do that, he will visit more flowers like this. And in doing so, he'll be more likely to get pollen to another flower of the same species. Not all pollinators are attracted by nectar, so not all flowers need to even make it. Sometimes the pollen alone, which the plant needs to make for its own purposes, is sufficient reward. Plants have evolved to provide whatever their insect pollinator needs. But when we talk about pollinators, we're not just talking about insects visiting flowers. An insect's life cycle includes complete metamorphosis with 3 or 4 stages in completely different forms, like this familiar butterfly metamorphosis. To support an insect that pollinates a plant as an adult, we must support it at earlier life stages. This means providing plants that the larva can eat. Monarch butterflies have had a great ad campaign, and most everyone now knows that you plant milkweed to help monarch butterflies. Not everyone realizes that monarch butterflies can get nectar from many different plants. It's just the caterpillar that can only feed on milkweeds, and so monarch eggs must be laid on milkweed plants. To support butterflies, a garden must provide both nectar for adult butterflies and what is called the larval host plants for their eggs, and these are different for each species or genera. Fritillary butterflies, for example, need violets for their larvae. But again, the adult butterfly can feed on many different flowers. It's the larval stage that's the critical stage to provide for. Nature has a lot of picky eaters, and it's not just that they don't like to eat other things, they've evolved so they can't eat other things. It's not just caterpillars that are picky. It turns out 1/3 of the native bees can only use the pollen from certain species of flowers to feed their young. Now, let's go back to the fact that plants are the basis of all food chains. Many insects don't eat either pollen or nectar. A lot of insects are not pollinators, but they're still very important because they're part of the food chain. As adults, some of them eat other insects, but most eat leaves at some, if not all, stages of their lives. And this is very important to understand. When it comes to leaves, plants and insects are not cooperating like they do with pollination. It's more like they're fighting a very long war. Plants may develop thorns to prevent browse by grazing mammals, but what can they do against insects that can get in any sort of crevices between thorns? Well, they use chemical warfare. To defend themselves, they literally create toxic chemicals. I just find it amazing to think about how this can happen. The insect, however, needs to eat, so it evolves to tolerate those defensive chemicals. But it's hard for an insect to develop a tolerance for a toxin, so it usually focuses on just its most important food plant. Because a defensive chemical may be shared by a whole genera or family of plants, the insect is able to eat leaves from any plant in that group. But since different families or genera of plants create different defensive chemicals, the insect has to avoid those plants. In this way, an insect evolves to only be able to eat a particular genus or perhaps family of plants. Hence, we have the monarch butterfly, whose larvae can only survive on milkweed leaves, but this includes all species in the milkweed genus Asclepias. Now, we talk about the monarch as if it was unusual, but it's not. 90% of insects are specialists like this. Only 10% are generalists that can feed across a variety of plants. So we need a wide variety of native plants to support a diverse population of native insects, because most are specialized to either pollinate or eat just a few specific plants. But what happens when many or most of the plants are not native? Let's look at that. This is where Doug Tallamy and his research assistants have made some really interesting observations. They looked at our friend, the chickadee. Caterpillars are the primary food that parents feed to their chicks. And the researchers learned that to raise an average brood of chicks, the parent chickadees had to provide 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to the chicks in the nest. And the parents continue to feed for 21 days after those chicks have fledged. That's a lot of caterpillars. And what do all those caterpillars eat? Turns out, mostly native plants. Native plants were much more efficient at producing insect biomass, at over 4 times as much than non-native plants were. and that included 35 times more caterpillar biomass. That means they provided a lot more food for those chicks. And the native plants supported over 3 times as many different herbivores. So native plants are much better at providing the food that herbivore insects eat, and in turn, better at providing for the chickadee and other birds, almost all of which feed high-protein insects and spiders to their young, even if they eat other things as adults. Now, the eminent biologist E.O. Wilson said in 1987 that insects are the little things that run the world because insects provide pest control, they decompose dead plants, they pollinate, and they're critical to the food web. Wilson explained that if insects were to disappear, so would almost all flowering plants and the food web they support. Following that, almost all of terrestrial animal life would go extinct, and humans would be unable to survive. So it seems that maintaining our insect populations might be a good idea for all of us. And we now know that native plants do the best job of providing food for native insects. Scientists still know so little about how ecosystems function that we often don't know which are the most critical pieces. You may have heard the metaphor of an airplane where multiple rivets hold the wing on, and you don't know which is the really important one, whose loss will mean the wing falls off. That's to help visualize the idea of keystone species, that some species are more important or even critical to keep everything running in an ecosystem. Keeping all the rivets is maintaining biodiversity. What would happen with many fewer species of both plants and insects? We don't know exactly, but we do know that biodiversity creates stability, makes ecosystems more efficient, it's more productive, that is, creates more biomass, and is more resistant to invasion and disturbance. I think we would agree stability and resistance to disturbance is especially important in this age of climate change with more destructive storms and weather extremes, not to mention invasive insects and plants. Diversity, however, interestingly enough, is helpful only when the species are contributing to ecosystem function. Just having a large variety doesn't make a positive difference. So a garden with many non-native species is probably not as good as one with fewer native species. Diversity allows redundancy, which is important in ecological stability. Maybe there are 5 different insects that can pollinate plant X. That redundancy enables the plant to survive and reproduce, even if something happens and only 2 or 3 of the insects are around. But with fewer pollinators, the risk is higher that you will lose them all. When you lose the last pollinator, you lose that plant species and then lose all the insects that depend primarily or largely on that plant for food and everything that fed on those insects. Plus, you lose the plant seeds that provided food for small mammals and birds. Perhaps a Jenga tower is a better metaphor than the plane's wings. In Jenga, when one piece is removed, the balance shifts and a different piece becomes most critical. Ecosystems are constantly changing, and so the most important piece is probably changing. But humans are removing pieces right and left. Unfortunately, it's a game with very high stakes. So what's someone to do? Well, the answer is pretty clear. In this case, you should plant native plants, and lots of them. But instead of focusing on just how to make our garden or our yard pretty, we need to focus on making it both pretty and productive at the same time. So remember these 4 things. They're really the top thing to focus on. First, that landscapes need to be hyper-productive to support the food web. Anywhere that has buildings and paving is not ecologically functioning. So yards and gardens have to make up for that paved and built area. Now here in the exurbs, we have a fair amount of natural area around, but we have to help compensate for the more urban areas that don't provide the ecosystem services required to sustain life. Ecosystem services, again, to remind you, is things like creating oxygen or filtering water or pollinating plants. The second big thing that landscapes need to do is support the pollinators, particularly native bees, in all stages of their life. Third, landscapes have to absorb and manage rainfall, which requires plant roots to hold the soil and absorb the water. Fourth, landscapes must capture carbon. Soils themselves, in addition to carbon contained in plant tissues, could hold 7 times more carbon if we had enough plants to put it there. And we know that would be a good thing. Speaking of carbon and the climate crisis, just this week, there was a story in the New York Times which announced a pair of new studies by international scientific panels, which said, unless the world stops treating climate change and biodiversity collapse as separate issues, neither problem can be addressed effectively. It's easy to ignore the fact that both climate change and loss of biodiversity are caused by unsustainable use of Earth's natural resources. The issue that these studies are looking at is that most policies target either climate change or biodiversity collapse, which can lead to negative consequences for the other one. But carbon literally connects the two issues. Carbon is increased atmospheric carbon dioxide, creating global warming, and carbon is the fundamental building block of life on Earth. It's clear now that nature can't store as much carbon as we're releasing through our use of fossil fuels. We can't plant enough trees to take up all the emissions. And a misguided focus on planting trees, for example, can actually harm biodiversity. As in Brazil, where to meet reforestation goals, they've been planting a monoculture instead of the naturally diverse rainforest. These studies recognize that climate interventions are more apt to hurt biodiversity than vice versa. The good news is improving biodiversity will often work also to help the climate. We need renewable energy, solar, for example, but we must first select appropriate locations instead of converting intact habitats to solar farms. We must be creative and do things like create pollinator habitat around solar arrays or allow grazing in order to address both climate and biodiversity together wherever we can. We can't focus on just one and ignore the other, or there will be unintended and negative consequences. Now, with the mantra pretty and productive in your mind, here are some more specific guidelines for making a landscape, a yard, that's more productive and contributes to the ecology of your area. The first one, as you probably heard other people talk about, is reduce the amount of lawn. Lawn is most of the time an ecological desert, and it's very useful a lot of times. So you're going to probably want to have some, but you should let the little plants that aren't the grasses live there, like violets, small flowering plants. You don't need to have a pure grass lawn. And there's a really easy way you can make your lawns ecologically better, which is to mow only every 2 weeks, which allows small flowers to bloom. A very interesting study was done that showed it was better to mow every 2 weeks than either every week or every 3 weeks. I don't understand that one, but that's what the research showed. So mow only every other week and makes it easier for you, and it's better for the environment. So another thing to do is let some areas be messy. We tend to want to clean everything up, but when you see a mess, what you see is a mess. Some creature sees as home or food. You should leave dead trees, which are important bee nest habitat, as well as for the birds. You can also help by creating brush piles for habitat, especially if you don't have natural areas around your home. You should leave the leaves as natural mulch and overwintering habitat for insects. If you delay your fall cleanup until we're well into spring, the insects that overwinter in stems and under leaves have a chance to emerge safely. And then you should create multi-layer, three-dimensional designs with ground covers, herbaceous layer of perennials or annuals, shrubs, and then trees. Let plants cover as much ground as possible. have a living ground cover instead of just barren mulch. Although you should use a mulch to prevent weeds and preserve moisture, prevent erosion, and keep the soil cooler when you're trying to get things established. I'm not speaking against mulch. It's just that a ground cover is the next step that you should take, to let it be a ground cover. An interesting recommendation that I found particularly interesting was to surround trees with something other than lawn, because most caterpillars, when they're fully grown, they fall to the ground to burrow in the soil or spin a cocoon in leaf litter to continue their development. But lawn soil is often too hard packed, and the short grass offers no appropriate place for cocoons. So that's a simple design element that you could incorporate. Now I've got two graphics here to show visually what I'm talking about, just in case that helps you to remember it. The point is, diversity of landscape and plants allows for diversity of wildlife. Wildlife, which includes everything from insects and frogs to possums and foxes, they all need food, water, shelter, and a place to raise their young. It's pretty clear there's nowhere to hide and not much to eat in the top two images. And I've seen things that look like that around here, is the scary part. It's not an exaggeration to see lawns like that. Next, we really have to stop using pesticides. Homeowners use more pesticides than farmers in the United States. That's just incredible to me. We create the ideal conditions for more insect problems when we apply pesticides, largely because we wipe out the, quote, good bugs along with the bad. Nature can control excessive damage by insects better by herself, and over thousands of years has created a self-regulating balance. There are many predator insects that create this balance. Besides the perhaps familiar praying mantis and ladybugs, they're minute pirate bugs, hoverflies, ground beetles, braconid wasps, aphid midges, many more. I do not know my insects very well, so I can't help you identify them, but I know that they're important. And since they go through several life stages, it can be hard to recognize them. So my suggestion is, assume any unfamiliar insect that you see is a friend, not a pest. To control insect herbivores naturally, as in let nature do it, you must allow some level of those same insects, because only if you have some of the bad insects will you maintain a population of their good predators. Don't assume because you see a couple of insects eating a plant that you have a problem. I actually, if I find a tomato hornworm in my vegetable garden, I leave it so that the wasp that parasitizes it will have a home, and then I never have a problem with the tomato hornworms. As much as 10% of leaves on a plant can be damaged before most people will even notice. So we don't have to have perfect plants. We have to learn to tolerate some leaves being eaten. I will admit that sometimes we're faced with much greater damage than 10% and feel we have to do something. But before you reach for even the, quote, natural organic products, remember that something as simple and targeted as a hand picking of the troublesome insect, or a hard spray of water or a smothering application of insecticidal soap may be sufficient. Now, I have to add that although we refer to some insects as beneficials, calling one bug good and another bad, it's just our perspective. Despite how we feel about some of them, like ticks, there are really no bad bugs in nature. There are, however, insects in the wrong place. Alien insects like the spotted lanternfly and emerald ash borer are serious threats because they've been transported here with none of their natural enemies that keep them in check in their homelands. There's something that a lot of people don't seem to understand. Killing one type of insect, like mosquitoes or ticks, almost inevitably kills many species that you aren't trying to kill. Spraying your yard, even with so-called natural or organic chemicals, or worse, having the town or the state do widespread spraying to eliminate mosquitoes, is doing more harm than good. If it's killing the target, it's killing many things. And we simply can't afford the losses to our ecosystem that these actions cause. If nothing else, the birds can't survive without the insects. One 2014 study concluded that the number of insects globally has reduced by 45% since 1974. 45%. And a comprehensive Cornell study found that North America has lost 2.9 billion adult birds since 1970. That's almost a third of our total bird population. That's in just 50 years. I'm not minimizing the danger of diseases carried by insects like mosquitoes and ticks, but the way to responsibly protect yourself is to protect your body with clothes or insect repellent sprayed on you. Another basic guideline for making your landscape an asset to the local ecosystem is to keep invasive plants out. An invasive plant displaces other species that are part of the ecological balance without replacing its ecological function. Even if they seem to provide food for birds, for example, many invasives are more like junk food. They don't provide the nutrients that birds need for migration. And some invasive plants like black swallowwort are similar enough to native milkweed that it fools the monarch butterfly into laying eggs on it, but the larva can't eat the leaves. It's an example of that very precise chemistry that's going on. All invasives are vigorous spreaders that crowd out native species, which basically means a less productive ecosystem. So you need to learn to recognize invasives and remove them. Garlic mustard, Japanese knotweed, black swallowwort, the yellow iris pseudacarus, oriental bittersweet, autumn olive, Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, burning bush, honeysuckle, buckthorn, Norway maple, Phragmites. There's a lot there to learn, but it will help. And be aware of new invaders, like there's porcelain berry now and mile-a-minute vine. So a little bit of garden design. You want to use natives for biomass of at least 70% of your garden. Tallamy suggests that that will be enough to maintain current wildlife levels. You don't have to be a purist or purge everything. Your grandmother's iris are okay, as long as they're not the invasive yellow iris. Just remember though, every plant that is an introduced species is taking the space of what could be a native and could be helping that chickadee or robin. I do worry about the glib generalizations that you hear sometimes promoting natives. They need no care in your garden, no watering, no fertilizer. Well, that's misleading, especially statements that they have no pests. If nobody is eating your plants, the plants are not doing their job. But all plants need to be established with special care after you plant them, and they'll grow well only in the right conditions, conditions which resemble their native habitat. For example, a beach or a bog, a sunny meadow, or a cool stream, a cool shade by the stream. There's a gardening slogan that's very helpful: right plant, right place. If you have shade, you need to plant plants that do well in shade. Likewise, a hot, dry, sunny yard, you want plants that thrive in those conditions. A wet spot needs plants that like wet feet. As for the design of your garden areas, plant in masses, at least 3 to 5 of each species of perennial. For pollinators, this is much more efficient. They're looking for more of what they just visited, not variety. And if you have space, try to have at least 3 flowers blooming for pollinators in each season. 3 in spring, 3 in summer, 3 in fall. There are lots of wonderful choices. So after recognizing what growing conditions you have, what natives should you consider? The ones that are the best sources of food for insects, I would say. It comes down to the insects, the little things that run the world. Insects provide pest control, decompose dead plants, pollinate, and are critical to the food web. By all means, grow berries for the birds, but what we need most are plants that provide nectar, pollen, and leaves for food. Many natives will do it all, so it's not like you really have to make a bad choice there. Across North America, 14% of plants make up 90% of the insect food. So just planting from those species, you'll be doing a huge amount to help the insects. And 5% of local plants host 3/4 of the butterfly and moth caterpillars. So these are the most important species to keep the food web going. Now, it can be a challenge to find good lists of recommendations, because even lists from reputable sources like the Xerxes Society, which is a butterfly society, they can be focused on just the flowers and neglect to consider the importance of host plant relationships. Some pollinator lists even include non-natives. So 2 websites I have for you to check out, and I've asked Rick to put these in the chat for you. The first one is the Native Plant Finder, which will give you plants ranked in terms of their ability to host caterpillars based on your zip code. So it's very precise to what is living in our area. And the second is an Audubon native plant database. And that one allows you to filter the results in some interesting ways and just look for trees or just perennials, or to filter by what kind of resource the plant's providing, caterpillars or nectar or fruit. I don't think it does pollen, but it does the others. Now, don't forget about trees and shrubs. When you're thinking about perennials, a lot of times for a garden, but trees and shrubs are really the backbone of things for insects. They're especially important for insects feeding on leaves. And if you can only plant one thing, Doug Tallamy would say to plant an oak, because nationwide, oaks support over 900 different species of caterpillar. In this area, I think it's something like 400 species. So they're really important everywhere. After that, consider willows and cherry and poplars and birch. Now, I do want to mention that cherry refers not to the little fruit trees in orchards, but to our large black cherry. And birch is not limited to the rather well-known white birch, but includes black birch, yellow birch, and river birch. For shrubs, you could plant aronia, which is chokeberry, blueberries, alder, blackberries or raspberries, hazelnuts, native roses, the dogwoods, serviceberry, the amelanchier, and different viburnums. But again, those websites will give you specific suggestions if you want to have the most impact. So I've talked a lot about caterpillars, which are butterfly and moth larvae, because of their importance in the food web. Although people refer to butterflies as pollinators, turns out they visit flowers and drink nectar, but they don't usually pollinate them. Their anatomy makes it less likely for them to transfer pollen, which is somewhat ironic, as most people making pollinator gardens are just trying to attract butterflies. Our most important pollinators are the native bees, of which there are about 400 species in New England. Now, bees themselves are not often eaten, perhaps for obvious reasons, but their importance in the food web lies in what fruits and seeds they enable through pollination. Most native bees are solitary and live in the ground or plant stems or twigs. Recognizing the special importance of bees, you may want to choose plants that support different bee species, especially threatened ones. Although his specialty is bumblebees, Robert Gegeer says we should be talking about pollination systems rather than just pollinators. He distinguishes between plants that provide pollen, which is essential for bee larvae, or the young bees in the hive, or not in the hive, as in the case with our native bees, because they're solitary for the most part, but in their nest spots where their eggs have been put in the ground or little compartments. He distinguishes between pollen plants and plants that provide nectar for adult bees. He's concerned that most pollinator gardens are just making the more common bees more common. He stresses the need to provide pollen early in the year with native willows when there's not a lot in bloom. Some of his other recommendations include native roses, blueberries, violets, milkweeds, meadowsweet, yellow wild indigo, and he points out that grasses, native grasses, including switchgrass, bluestem, and lovegrass, are as important as flowers for the bees. He has lists of plants for native bumblebees on the web, and there are a couple more links that I've asked Rick to put in the chat for you, which will take you to some of Robert Gegeer's lists and tell you more about what he's doing. He really is looking for citizen scientists to help him in his work as well. So a couple of final suggestions for you. You may have heard straight species are usually better for wildlife than the cultivars or nativars. A cultivar is a plant that's been selected for characteristics that people prefer, such as larger flowers or different color flower, disease resistance, or height. Nativar is a new term now used for cultivar of a native plant. Now, some of these characteristics may not matter to insects, like height or disease resistance, but flower size and color are usually very important and may make a plant less attractive to an insect. There may also be changes in the nectar or pollen in a cultivar that happened as a result of the selection, and those things are not even visible to people, but may be crucial to insects. Exceptions to the straight species preference have been discovered, but it's uncommon. There's a phlox called Jenna, which has smaller pink flowers than most varieties, and it has proved to actually be more attractive to pollinators. As I say, there's always exceptions, but most of the time, your best bet is to go with what they call a straight species, something that doesn't have a name after it, like blackjack or sweet perfume or something like that. Sometimes you won't be able to find a non-cultivar form of a species. And in this case, don't worry, it's better to plant that nativar than to plant a non-native. The nativar is just a cloned version, and it may not be as good, but it's still good. Other little things, skip the double flowers. They have traded their reproductive parts, which is the stamens, for petals. So they have no pollen and no function in the environment other than just looking nice for us. You should also avoid selections with red or purple leaves because the anthocyanins in those are actually deterrents to feeding. If you can't resist having some non-natives, I admit, I'm not getting rid of everything myself. You first should consider species from nearby, somewhere within our larger ecoregion, which is basically the East or the Midwest. And by selecting from these areas, your plant's more apt to have an ecological relationship with local insects. So that's all I have for you today, but I am happy to try to answer any questions. And I will stop sharing my screen so that I can see some of you, if I can figure that out. There we go.
Thank you very much, Jessie. So we'll take questions, maybe in the chat. So if there's a bunch, we'll go with chat. You can use stack to indicate that you've got a question in the queue if you don't want to write it all out.
Hey, let's see. Clint, I'll scan down here. Clover definitely thrives against lawn grass. It used to be in all sorts of lawns. The white clover is actually not native, but it certainly seems to be better than straight grass for your lawn. Let's see. Violets are like invasive. Yep, I know. It's wonderful, isn't it? Now I can say it's okay to leave those violets in my garden and in my yard. Apart from garlic mustard, are there other invasive plants in Stow? Yes, dozens. The ones I listed are probably all in Stow. You can go to, if you search online, just look invasive plants Massachusetts, you will come up with some state sites and nonprofit sites, all of which will give you lists and pictures of different invasives, so you can help learn them. Can honeybees and native bees coexist in the same garden, or are they competitive, aggressive with each other? They definitely coexist. I definitely see both of them. Whether they are, I don't think they're aggressive with each other, but it's a really interesting question as to whether they're competitive with each other. There are people who think that the native bees are worse off because the honeybees are taking a lot of the resources. So I think they are in competition, but we can't survive without the honeybees at this point. That's the way it is. Carpenter bees are one of our native bees. And it's too bad when they want to eat on your house. I know we want them to be in the trees, but that is a problem, I admit. So that's most of the questions that I see. Disposing of knotweed and bittersweet. Yeah, ugh. You can burn them in the wintertime. You definitely don't want to let them spread around your property, though. You want to put them in one location so that you don't have lots every location.
We have a question from Madhu that was just directed to me. Can we plant poplar trees in shade?
I don't think poplars will do very well in shade. I think of them as pioneer species, which really are sun loving. It's tough. It's tough for trees to get started in shade, even if they end up, in a forest as part of a mass. But to start them under shade, there are not that many that are very tolerant of that. Any other questions from folks? Well, other than oak, what would I suggest for planting? I was impressed with how important willows were, both for the bees and for the other insects. So I was thinking I want to try and find somewhere to plant more willows. Now, there are several different native willows that bloom at slightly different times. If you go to Robert Gagear's website or his information that was posted, he lists the specific varieties, the specific species, and gives you the bloom time. There's charts that show the bloom time as well as the species names, so you can get more information on those sites. Much of Stow is red maple swamp. Is that a more rich habitat than a native plant garden? Well, I think the reality is that it's nature, but the maple does not come up very high on most of the insects eating lists. So I was surprised at that, but it's definitely after the willows and black cherries and birches. I think it's more, I think it's better than ash, I think, and better than some of the others more uncommon trees. But it was interesting that is really our dominant tree. I agree in many areas, but you're providing variety. When you have a native plant garden or enhanced woodland, or field, whatever you've got, some of sun or shade. Best natural poison ivy fighter. Long sleeves and good gloves. How do you make a meadow in place of lawn? That is a complicated process, and there are definitely good resources out there. I can't begin to explain them, but it is not as easy as Meadow in a Can would like you to think. But the Vermont Wildflower, I think, is the name of a company that does do seeds for meadows and things like that. But again, that's something you should look for other resources. Preserve lady slippers. If you have many, oh, you're so lucky. They are wonderful. The best thing you can do is to not touch them and to not dig around them. The pink lady slippers, I assume you're talking about, because the yellow ones are quite uncommon. The pink lady slippers have very long, very shallow roots. They're fragile, long white roots that go right under the duff of the surface. And those roots, when they go out, once they're broken off, they don't regrow. I was involved with an effort at plant rescue with the Wildflower Society, now the Native Plant Trust, back up many years ago. And so they were putting this big condominium complex down near 128. And there were a lot of pink lady slippers. So we were trying to see how many we could rescue and plant at the Garden in the Woods. So we went in, and there were some that had these little roots, these amazing little white fragile things, 10, 15 feet long, going out from the plant. But there's not like a fibrous thick mat. It's just a single, there would be like maybe 6 or 8 or 10 of these little roots. And so you can't really dig around them without damaging those. And so I would say the best thing to do is leave them absolutely alone and let things just be wild around them. Don't try to create a garden around them, in other words, because you're more apt to lose them. The deer population yes, the deer population is a huge problem. They like, among other things, they like lady slippers. They like almost anything. And it's a big challenge. And they're one of the reasons we actually have, we're losing the next generation, if you will, in our forests because they browse all the seedlings. And that means that when something happens and you have a tree come down and you have a light gap, there are not that many seedlings that can grow up again in that space. Instead, you have the bittersweet climbing the trees and the Japanese knotweed coming in and things like that. So the deer are definitely having a big impact on the native plant population. There's not a lot we can do. I actually have a fence, I have to admit, because I have a lot invested in my garden. But that's not feasible, especially for all our wild areas. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you all so much.
And thank you, Jessie. This has been great. I mean, it was a very, very informative topic. I think many of us appreciate your time with us. And I know I've already had requests for a recording from tonight, and we hope to be able to share that on Stow TV and elsewhere. So,
okay. Well, good luck to you all. And as I say, I learned things in preparing, and so I'm glad if you learned some things. And even if you just are able to take away a couple of things and make some changes, you know, that's making a difference. So I encourage you to do what you can. All right.
thank you very much.
Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Stop the recording.
Did.